If a mother of a child who was raped or has autism says, I don't think this trans thing is really what's going on, how is it possible there are actual adults over 25 who are teachers in the school who think that is terrible, that is bigoted, that is something that ought to lose you your child if you cannot get on board with their every idea? I find it so mind-blowing, sort of this enactment of great adultification of children and making children the authority on themselves and the authority on their identity and all of that. At an age they don't even have a meaningful sense of identity, what it even means. And at the same time, parents just terrified to be parents.
You must be some kind of therapist.
Today I'm speaking again with my friend Laura Wiley Haynes. She is a mother and grandmother, a CASA, which stands for Court-Appointed Special Advocate, and a writer. I always enjoy hearing Laura's deep thoughts on childhood development, attachment, trauma, the infant-mother or infant or child-parent bonds, and the intergenerational aspects of trauma, dissociation, and mental health stuff. And of course, it's all very relevant toward our shared interest in what's going on with the gender crisis today. So Laura, so good to see you again. Welcome back.
Thank you.
You have some interesting ideas on the intergenerational aspects of the gender crisis. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
I guess I would say I'm trying to figure out what has changed. That suddenly, relatively recently, the last 10 years or so, we have greater and greater numbers of kids ostensibly unable to launch in their sexed bodies as tweens or young adolescents and claiming this terrible dysphoria that's telling them they don't belong in themselves. And so I think about it from a developmental point of view because a lot of developmental issues can be expressed in similar ways. People who have depersonalization, so they feel like they're sort of not a human, they're a robot or an object, or derealization where they feel like they're not in themselves and they're kind of diffused throughout the room, or things like that have to do with self-perception. And I think gender has a lot to do with self-perception. So I'm kind of interested in what might be going on developmentally. And, of course, as Jonathan Chait points out, we have screens now that we didn't used to have, and cell phones and social media might be a big part of staring into a thing instead of staring into the eyes of a person. And the thing is maybe not giving you what you need to locate yourself the same way the eyes of a person might do. And my thoughts on daycare, and I think there's a lot of lack of relational care in a group environment. You're not one-on-one relating, locating your mind and one other mind and seeing what the interface is between them. You're kind of lining up in the line, or it's time to eat, or it's time to get your backpack, or whatever. It's a little more mechanized and people aren't deeply relating as they deal with you. The way a one-on-one relationship is a little deeper at all times and tracks with what happened an hour ago or what happened 2 days ago, where, multiple caregivers in a group setting might not have any idea what you might be referring to from 3 hours ago, that kind of thing. And I feel like I think my place in the timeline is kind of informing this too, because when I was first a young mother, that was when these options for group care first came along. And so I thought, some of my peers just taking that turn, running off to law school and making partner, and many of them had nannies, but some of them used group care. And there was something in me that just couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. And I think it's probably a lot because I received, one-on-one dyadic maternal care when I was little. So somehow my worldview or instincts were tuned by that. And it felt really counterintuitive to drop my tiny, tiny baby off at some group, you know? So I just couldn't, anyway, I couldn't do it luckily because I was a writer. I didn't have to, and I could get a babysitter into my home and get things done that way and be around. But, I watched the whole culture change, and I think it might have even changed before I was a little girl, because I was a little girl that was kind of brought up to be socialized to be my dad in many respects. People were already in the 60s and the 70s saying, you can be anything, you can be an astronaut, you can go to business school, and meaning, don't limit your dreams, which was a well-intended message, but nobody was saying, you can be an incredible mother. Nobody was reinforcing anything about the traditional female role. So you might, even me growing up, there might have already been a kind of a devaluation inadvertently of that role under the best intentions of not limiting our visions, So anyway, I wonder how far back you might have to go to get to a person that had, 4 grandparents, all of whom received dyadic care. And maybe that would be for a piece, because maybe in antiquity, a lot of people died and stuff like that, and you didn't get that care because your mom died in childbirth or whatever. So I don't think it's ever been perfect. But it has never also been where so many adults seem to lack intuitive capacities of how to handle sad children, how to determine what's really going on beneath the surface of a sad child, how to go about keeping your feet in reality while your child is flying out of reality, and being that anchor. And instead, I think a lot of parents have this idea that if they're not agreeing with the ideation that their child brings to them, that they're somehow not supporting their child, not being loving, not being evolved, or something like that. And it's kind of bizarre how reluctant people are to say, what are you talking about? That's a nutty idea. God, that sounds completely illogical to me. Or even saying, you think you're a boy, huh? That's so unusual. I can't, tell me more about it. What is that? How does it express itself in your mind? Like, when are some moments where that thought has come up, and what was going on? And they just have to immediately start cheering for it. So I feel like we have impaired grownups, and that's a big part of child distress and chasing, after false answers. And I think it's just a kind of a slow moving train wreck, because until all these very sad kids started cropping up, nobody was really aware of how diminished the dyad had become. It happened very gradually, and the first crops of kids weren't obviously immediately off track when they were 6 or 7 or 8. So we kind of got away with it, or we seemed to get away with it. And then ages started nudging lower and lower and lower of separation. And the number of kids turning out shaky in their sense of self started growing. So this is what I suspect. Because there can't, unless it's a plastics in the water supply, like, how many things could it be?
Oh, it's that too.
Pollution, bad nutrition, metabolic syndromes. There are a few other things, but I think the amalgamation of all of these things, but really why I have to go to dyadic care is because we know what happens to people who don't get secure attachment when they're little, and it's lacking sense of self when they're older, and having trouble self-regulating, having, paranoid thoughts about others wanting to get them, or, they're not able to cope well because they don't have the kind of relational skillfulness, ability to read people, ability to be read by people, basic trust in those things. So I'm worried that if we're just looking at why are the kids so unhappy in social media and films, what we're not looking at is why are the parents so bad at guiding an unhappy kid out of their unhappiness? And where is the natural skill for it? And I just think that is a skill you learned from your own mother. And so the fewer and fewer and fewer dyads there are, the more diffuse that skill gets, the more, it's not, operating strength in society. And then, of course, kids are facing these adults who don't seem to know what they're doing. And that's got to scare kids too.
Anecdotally, I've met a fair number of detransitioners and desisters who had some kind of very early attachment trauma, like, for example, being born premature and spending their first, 4, 6, 8 weeks in the NICU. But this early separation in some way, whether it's time in the NICU or adoption.
Adopted out, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't know if there's any data on it.
Well, the real expert in this stuff is Dr. Alan Shore, and he has studied suicidal people. And there's a huge likelihood, if you're a suicidal person, that you had relational trauma in your first year. And I think there's something about pre-verbal trauma where no one can explain it to you. You can't express it. You can't discharge it. No one has the means to reach you and say, this isn't your fault or whatever. So it's very easy for a baby to turn against themselves and to think there must be something wrong with me. And that's why I'm stuck here in this NICU and no one's touching me. They don't understand someone's trying to save their life.
Yeah, wow, that's fascinating. The suicide statistic. Can you say more about that?
Well, it's just that he feels that when a suicidal person has a set of symptoms that amplify one another and work together in a bad way, and they are to be emotionally dysregulated, to be physiologically dysregulated, like the vagus nerve or heart rate or queasy stomach, and also to be alexithymic. So you're divorced from being able to name or understand all of the things you're feeling, but you're feeling them with great intensity and they don't remit. And that if you get into the wrong cyclone of these things feeding off each other, it can take you down suicidal despair because it's just getting worse and worse and you can't name it, you can't understand it, and you can't get rid of it. And so that's his theory. And his other theory is that you can't really form a sense of self until you can regulate your feelings. And only after being able to handle calming down on your own and regulating your feelings on your own are you finally aware that, oh, I actually have this other self that can do stuff without her. And that's the beginning of understanding your sense of self. While you're still just, collapsing and sobbing over any small disappointment and mommy come in and scoop you up and help you, you're still not quite there at the cusp of selfhood the way you are when you can start doing something on your own to address your own distress. So those are his thoughts, and they make a lot of intuitive sense to me. And I can say anecdotally that all of the people I know who've had a trans identification have had a lot of disruption, whether group care, trauma, abandonment, and that kind of thing in early life. And again, from my CASA connection, most foster youth have had that happen to them because most of them, average age of surrender is quite young, is 3, under 3 in California. So that'd be the average age, meaning, 7 or 8 or 9 would be old to enter foster care.
Seems like from a developmental perspective that there are, I guess I'm thinking of it like wells that need to be filled at different stages, and certain needs or developmental capacities have greater precedence during certain chapters of life. So, for example, the narcissistic well is, traditionally associated with ages 3 to 5 or 6 or so. It's that stage where the child has enough self-consciousness and enough of a separate sense of self to know there's a me for you to look at. You look at me, and who am I in your eyes? Am I good in your eyes, right? Like a child needs a certain amount of, yes, you are wonderful during that chapter of life in order to not have problems with narcissism later on. There's, and so I'm thinking about, well, what are the other sort of wells that need to be filled before and after that, and part of what I hear you saying is that from early on, there's this well of nurturance and co-regulation at a really foundational level of what's happening in the nervous system that regulates everything else. And through good enough mothering during that phase, that allows the child to not be so dependent on the mother. And I wonder if you think that, when you talk about failure to launch, and I'm glad you opened with that, because I think it is really tied in with the gender issues. And I think we should talk about like what's going on in the developmental stages of 15 to 25 or so. But when you talk about failure to launch, it's like sometimes there's almost like they didn't get enough of something that was supposed to be supplied a lot earlier on. And so then there's a need for that at an inappropriate time. I'll give an example. So this is kind of analogous to what we're talking about, which is thinking about a parent of a mid-20s trans-identified male who's recently on estrogen and has been having these mood swings and tantrums that make him look like a 13-year-old girl. But I mean, that's what estrogen does to a male, right? And so I was talking with the parents about this idea of second puberty that they love, that they romanticize in the trans world. And I thought, if this is language that your son uses in his online discourse, if he's romanticizing his own mental health symptoms as part of, oh, it's just all signs of my second puberty, right? Then maybe you can actually kind of use some of that same language to talk about how vulnerable it must be in your mid-20s to be having these emotional meltdowns like a teenage girl in a context where you don't have the support of a teenage girl. You don't have parents and a society around you that's like, well, there's just a moody teenage girl doing moody teenage girl stuff. No, like, it's a different look on a person of your age and sex, right? So just kind of framing it that way, like, how do you feel like you can almost in some ways like afford, not just financially, but afford to experience the recklessness of the first few years of female roller coaster, setting aside the fact that those aren't even the right chemicals in his bloodstream. Like, so, here it's like a young man who's in a time in life that he needs to be focused on building himself up, building up his reputation, his career, his financial security, his, what he has to offer as a mate. All that stuff is what a young man ideally needs to be focusing on at 25 if he's not going to be a train wreck at 30 or 40. But he's trying to get something that we associate with what a teenage girl is going through. But then I'm wondering what else is there? Like this, romanticizing the tearfulness, for example, that comes with being on estrogen. Because there are males who they're hot messes. They're crying and panicking constantly because they're taking these drugs that make them do that. And they're subscribing to an ideology that makes them messes. But then they romanticize it because it's all part of their second puberty and it's just evidence, it's confirmation that they're a girl. It's like, okay, so you're trying to get in touch with some vulnerable, needy part of you. But what happened when you were a baby? That like it's because when you were a baby, that was when it was appropriate for you to cry. And that was when the world around you needed to take care of you in that state.
Yeah, and it makes me wonder two things. One, I wonder if it's a enactment of I see it as the likelihood is that young man now on estrogen was probably dysregulated prior to being on estrogen. And estrogen might, tweak it and turn it up a notch, and it might excuse it in some way. But if you're self-regulated, you're not going to go backwards into lack of self-regulation, because self-regulation isn't a hormonal status. It's an ability to recognize how you feel and modulate. If you're overwhelmed with unhappiness, how do you address that? That isn't lie down on the floor and wail. And we all have our specific ways. Some people go for a run, some people call a friend, some people take a bath, some people change a venue. There's all kinds of things you can do to go, all right, I'm not going to go overboard on this right now. It's not the moment. I have to go to work or whatever. And so we all have our strategies, but developing strategies is part of growing up. And so it just strikes me that if somebody's 16 or 18 and they start on estrogen and they're having these crying jags, they were probably dysregulated beforehand. And the other thing that kind of teases at my mind is that I see this behavior as an enactment. And if you say no one can see the real me as a girl, and people only see an Adam's apple and a boy, but it might be true that nobody can see the real them. It might be true in a much more profound way that, for example, if something happens to you and you're a baby, nobody knows about it. I mean, I used an example one time of, let's say the daycare provider's own child is pinching you every day. Like, you're a baby, you can't tell anybody about it. All you know is that it's really unhappy when you go to that house and you don't like it and this kid pinches you, and that's just a simple explanation of something that's unseen, undealt with, unrecognized. And it could be a lot bigger, and so I feel like sometimes these kids are saying, you don't see me, or I can't locate me. And so if I can't locate me inside me, how can I find me, And so they're barking up the wrong tree, but the dilemma may be real.
That's so wise. And it goes right back to the conversation I just had with Dr. Elliot Kamenetsky. So he's an expert in obsessive compulsive disorder. And I was interviewing him about how gender ideation overlaps with OCD. And he talked about this fixation on the idea that I have a true authentic self somewhere, right? That maybe I'm not being that person, and maybe I need to be trans in order to be that person. And how alluring this idea is. And we were talking about, what is the element of truth in there, that there is a need for some kind of authenticity, a need to find yourself. And that the danger, of course, being that now you're convinced that where you're going to find that involves a path of permanent physical self-harm. But it seems like there's a real theme here. And it's like, as I help parents try to unpack what's going on for their child, how to understand it psychologically, and then how to figure out how to use that understanding to address how they communicate differently. It's like, if you're hearing that one element in the kid's story, this element of, I'm longing to be the real me, how can the parent maybe think about where some of that might be coming from? Is this a kid that, was performing for you in some way, whether that's academically or something like that? Can you offer your empathy? But going back to your point, Laura, about where are the parents in their strength, I've noticed that, and I have wonderful people coming to me, and I'm very grateful for my consulting clients, but difficulty with remembering that you are the adult is a theme for a lot of people. And I've coached people through really basic boundary setting, for example, because if you're dealing with a young adult child, as a lot of my clients are, their kids are over 18, there are still things you can do. And so, like, for example, I remember coaching a family in how to say, instead of getting really, really mad at your kid for disrespecting your time and showing up late to a family occasion, can you just say, hey, if you're not here in 15 minutes, we're starting without you? and noticing the family saying, our kid would not be mad about that. And I'm going, okay, well, then there's your work, right? There's your work. If you're not here in 15 minutes, we're starting without you. And everybody can stay regulated that way.
Well, and again, if you are kind of afraid to set a reasonable boundary with your child, things have been going off-piste for a while. There should be nothing. I mean, I am worried about an adult who has a near adult child and still hasn't realized they have a right not to be made to wait at a restaurant for 40 minutes without ordering just because one person coming to the event hasn't shown up. And I know that, too, sometimes kids who lack a sense of self can get a little juice of self by making other people dance, like, you didn't wait for me? Well, I'll storm out and slam the door. Or, oh, everybody waited for me. I guess they really do think I'm important. But there's can be a game being played in some of those behaviors. And if it's just really being a knucklehead and not paying attention to the time, then just start the dinner and they'll go, oh, wow, I couldn't believe how late I was. I'm so sorry. But either way, my parents were not afraid of me at all. And I had intense feelings. And I disagreed with them. But I never, ever remember anybody lacking the gumption to draw a line, to tell me I was wrong, to punish me, to shame me. I mean, they did not have a hard time telling me, oh, I'm really not proud of what you did, and this is really, disappointing to me, and this is why, And I'm not sure I would have wanted them to be afraid of me, because then how do you fight back against someone who's walking on eggshells around you? Or how do you say, oh, that stupid jerk with his stupid opinion, if you never got an opinion? You kind of need to at least, whatever, you need the reality of a real person declaring their actual thoughts and feelings about the real things you're doing, or no one's in reality in the whole room, and I'm not sure how you're going to get a kid to get more in reality if the very basic realities of the boundaries of others are not ever communicated,
Do you have an adolescent or adult child who is at risk of heading down a path of medical self-destruction in the name of so-called gender identity? The ROGD Repair course and community for parents is a whole new toolkit that will be a game changer for you. ROGD Repair is an interactive and ever-expanding toolkit of psychology concepts and communication skills curated specifically for parents like you, based on what has actually worked for my clients who were desperate to improve their relationships and save their kids. ROGD Repair is designed based on my theory of the trifecta of social contagion. Gender ideology doesn't operate in a vacuum, but in a perfect storm along with wokeness and cluster B personality traits. This trifecta is perfectly designed to take advantage of every psychological vulnerability in your child. Fortunately, that's where ROGD Repair comes in. ROGD Repair is designed with your child's psychology in mind too, even if they're an adult. ROGD Repair teaches you to work with rather than against their present state of mind, using psychology concepts and communication skills that are uniquely suited for your situation. So stop overwhelming yourself with horror stories and worst-case scenarios and more medical information than you need. Start working smarter, not harder. Start equipping yourself to repair the way the gender crisis has impacted your family today. Visit rogdrepair.com and you can use promo code SOMETHERAPIST2024 at checkout to take 50% off your first month. That's rogdrepair.com. I definitely do understand what it's like to be a child who senses that your own energy, power, or emotions can overpower that container.
You need to take care of you.
Yeah. Yeah. And then you're afraid of your power, right? Because you're afraid of your emotions. You're afraid of everything because you're just like me, this little bundle of instinct and energy, right? That is still trying to make sense of the world and find my place in it. And like you're saying, like locate myself in relation to other beings is inherently overwhelming to the adults. Well, then who are the adults? Is there anyone here?
If they're not if they're overwhelmed, I remember I found something that I'd written down for my father once long ago, and he'd saved it. And I found it when I was cleaning out his desk after he died. And it was kind of a list of things that parents should remember about kids. And one of them was, we don't want to fight with you. We're trying to get along with you. And, don't have evil motives, or whatever. And it was a few things like that. And I guess where I'm going with that is, if you are overwhelmed by your kid's anger and all your kid is feeling is, it's hard to be a teenager. You don't know the pressure I'm under. Everybody's been yelling at me all day long. I got a demerit in school. I got a bad grade on a test. And now you're picking at me. And they're just a good kid in a meltdown. And the mom or dad might be scared. Then on top of feeling like you don't get me, you're feeling like you don't even get that I'm a good kid. You think I'm a dragon that can burn you with my fire, and I can't. I want you to take care of me, not to back away in fear of me. And, I think when teenagers are melting down, they're feeling very toddlery. They have no sense that they're, 5'11" and they think they need care. That's mostly why people melt down, is feeling they need care. And then the parent is now afraid to give the care. And it's like a guessing game. Whereas if somebody could just stand their ground and declare, like, this is where I am, and have it be real, then it gives the other person at least the invitation to say, well, okay, you may think that this is where I am. But if, I don't know, I get this feeling that a lot of parents are very unclear about how you could be both forceful and disagree and draw lines or boundaries in a loving way that would feel loving, or at least wouldn't feel unloving. And it shocks me that people don't understand that register, because I would say like 90% of what my parents said to me or instructed me in was in that register. Well, you don't understand, but someday you're going to be older and you're going to see our point of view on this. I know that doesn't help you right now, but we have to kind of make a judgment call. And so here it is. And they spend a lot of time in that register of here it is and here's why. And we get it that you don't agree, but here are the principles that undergird our decision. And this is why we think it's the right decision. And I got a lot of it, so it just doesn't flummox me to be able to deliver a lesson like that, I don't feel afraid of it, because it didn't strike me as mean or harsh when my parents, I might have cried or slammed the door and said, oh, you're so mean. But it didn't lastingly make me think they were mean. I heard that they had another purpose in mind, like, you cannot get the facial tattoo because we think you might regret that, And I believed that they actually had my best interest at heart. And so even if I thought they were wrong, I didn't feel they were. And it seems like now, like, for example, it's infected into the schools. If a mother of a child who was raped or has autism says, I don't think this trans thing is really what's going on, how is it possible there are actual adults over 25 who are teachers in the school who think that is terrible? That is bigoted, that is something that ought to lose your child. It ought to lose your child if you cannot get on board with their every idea. And I just I find it so mind-blowing. I find it so mind-blowing that anybody think that, it's just sort of this enactment of great adultification of children and making children the authority on themselves and the authority on their identity and all of that at an age where they don't even have a meaningful sense of identity, what it even means. And at the same time, parents just terrified to be parents and unable to be parents and being so feeble or lame about what many people would just see to be the normal parental reaction, the requisite parental reaction. And so if this is what's informing me about my suspicions about lack of dyadic care as a big driver, because in a daycare group care situation, you are not getting parented. You aren't getting parenting. You aren't getting a lengthy explanation with the moral or story about your cousin who made the same mistake, or, you're not. You're just getting like, chop, chop, time to line up. Let's go eat. Stop it. And so if you've grown up, and sometimes that happens in a home. I'm not saying like you can't have a parent that is pretty much chop, chop, shut up and do what I say, because some parents are very authoritarian. But if you haven't had an authoritative parenting experience as a child, where do you come up with it? I mean, maybe you saw it on This Is Us. Maybe you saw somebody on TV or in a movie or in a book, but the feeling that it's natural to deeply disagree in a family from love, and that nobody's head should fall off if that happens, like that seems much fainter today than when I was a kid. We all, get our own hand of cards, and some of the things our parents teach us or model for us are helpful and some are unhelpful, and we all have to contend with that. And what I'm saying is, culturally, when not only do you have to contend with what you got and didn't get, but what you completely never saw, or which really just never entered into your way of being or thinking. And, for example, too, I imagine that if you're separated from your child all day long and you go and pick them up at 5:00, you don't want to say the big lecture and give a no that has good reasons behind it and is a teaching experience, because you just got to see your child at the end of a long day and they just got to see you, and you kind of really rather say yes.
A parent who only has your child half the time, it makes it really hard for him to discipline them because he misses them for half the week. So the other half the week,
to feel like you missed them,
yeah,
not like you're mad at them.
Yeah, so it makes it hard to, make sure that they have chores and responsibilities and that they get disciplined when they've done something wrong, because there's this, I just want to enjoy the time I have with them because it's already not enough.
Yeah. And so, when we change these small parts of our culture, we think of them as small parts, we change the entire meta for children. And, there was a sort of a meta, like when I was a little girl, I was born in 1961. And when I think back to being like 6 or 7 years old, you call the other adults Mrs. So-and-so, there were there were rules, there were ways of being polite, ways of being a good guest. My parents imparted those rules to me. They reinforced them a lot. And, I just wonder, how do kids acquire social skillfulness and a sense of guiding rules if they're never, ever just farting around in the neighborhood and going to somebody else's house and, unexpectedly being invited for dinner and, would all the little wend your way through those things, or, I don't know. There's just so many things that are, like when I was little, it was normal you'd call someone on the telephone, you'd speak to their mother or their father before they'd put your friend on the phone. And it was just typical and commonplace. And if you're 15 years old or 14 years old and wanted to call your best girlfriend, you just had to run the gauntlet of their mother, or their brother, or somebody before you could get to them. And, then cell phones obliterated that. And now you have kids who are afraid to call some family friend that they've known for 20 years to see about whether they might have a job at the hardware store for them this summer. And they're just afraid to do it.
Oh, yeah. So talk about failure to launch.
And so, like, all I'm saying is all the baby steps of launching have a mom or a dad there, not a babysitter, not someone who doesn't care how you come out, not someone on whom your moral conduct does not reflect, like somebody who cares and is vested in how you reflect on them. And sometimes that could be a negative way too, but a parent really, more than anybody, is going to have a stake in how you come out, and they're going to take that extra time. And all of these experiences are just getting lost. And so, summer jobs for that matter. I mean, how many high school kids had summer jobs when COVID was all of high school? If I was a mother, I wouldn't want my kid working in some McDonald's job where they might get a disease there was nothing to treat, So we're just contracting the number of experiences that little children reliably have.
Yeah. Yeah, I see it and I feel it, and I see it for the detransitioners too. Like I got into this exchange on X with Laura Becker about how she's trying to get all of her friends to move to Phoenix so they can live in a house together. And I'm going, do it, ladies. You're in your 20s. Like, your generation has missed out on so many formative social experiences. The least you can do is go live with your friends in your 20s and have some IRL, some in real life social experiences with your friends. And you draw a good connection there between, all those little things of your friend's mom picking up the phone and just these things that used to be part of life. And then people having the energy and skills for talking to adults when they are young adults. And it's all part of this failure to launch. Failure to launch is just 1,000 micro skills that are all missing or underdeveloped or atrophied in some way.
And like a pre-smartphone childhood, you had to figure stuff out. Stuff happened. You had to figure it out. You couldn't just call your mom on her cell phone from your cell phone and be picked up. So, you'd get dropped off somewhere all day. Then something happens. You don't have money, or things happen. And I think when I was a kid, you had more opportunities to learn how to be resourceful. It was also a suburban neighborhood type environment. So even if you had no money and really things went wrong, you're not getting way out of bounds on your street with people that So I was given a lot of opportunities to fend for myself and figure things out. And so by the time I went to college, it was not hard to launch. It was like, get me out of here. I'd love to be out of here and do my own thing for a while. I did not feel scared or intimidated by being across the country in a new place where I didn't know anybody, because I was like chomping at the bit to do that. And part of the reason I was chomping at the bit for it was a little bit of benign neglect in my childhood that gave me the skills to plan things, to know how to take a bus, to know where the bus schedule was, to look up the schedule, to find out where I had to transfer, and to go see a friend from summer camp when I was 12 years old. And I could do that whole thing. And like I say, there was a little bit of neglect probably sprinkled in there, but I think I was old enough by the time, like, my mom got kind of in the 70s, got interested in yoga and Sanskrit and all of these other things, and just started really pursuing her own interests. But then again, we were sort of like 14 through 8. And at that point, we could kind of, make dinner or do what needed to be done if my mom didn't make it home at the time we were expecting her, whatever. Um, so yeah, so now I feel like there's this kind of concierging that parents are doing that is really not healthy. And then it makes them, um, it, they lack mettle when it's really important to draw a hard no. If you haven't drawn reasonable no's for good reasons that you talked out many times when someone was 7, 9, 12, when they're 16 and you're like venturing a no for, you're going to meet someone from a chat room, what? They're not necessarily going to feel you have any credibility. You're not going to know how to do it. You're not going to have the pattern of conflict, resolved conflict, come in for the hug, let me come upstairs in 2 hours and check on you. I know you're really disappointed in my decision. Do you understand why I think it was a good one? I'm understanding why you don't think it was a good one. And, again, when you don't practice this and it falls into your lap with trans and a 16-year-old, I just think, it's like asking for somebody to be a black diamond skier their first day on skis, But if you've handled the 3-year-old freaking out because they can't put shoes on the dog and they cry for 20 minutes and throw things and tell you you're mean and, you're not mean and, well, okay. And you cruise through that, like that is just a little more ballast for when you really need the ability to draw boundaries for yourself or for your child. And sometimes kids want you to. That's the other funny thing. I remember one time my daughter was invited somewhere that she knew it was a bad idea, and I heard her on the telephone. She's talking to the person and she's saying, "Oh, I'll ask my mom. I'll ask her right now, just a second. Mom?" And she's shaking her head. And I was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, no, da, 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 da." She's like, "Oh, my mom said no." So, sometimes they can't say no for a variety of reasons, And I just really feel badly for the parents who are now young adults or adults who did not receive competent, boundaried parenting, because I don't blame them for not knowing that register. I just think it's one of those things that you learn in the doing. And, so now I'm really seeing the whole intergenerational thing is that the child is learning how to be a parent. The parent is learning how to be a parent. The child is learning how to be a child. The appropriate roles of both in the context of that relationship. And you keep adjusting and keep adjusting. So it's kind of easy at the beginning because all you have to do is keep them fed and dry, and held. And they're not, challenging you or pushing your buttons. Well, maybe they're pushing your buttons, a little bit from fatigue. But so if you haven't received it, and so then you wind up with a mother that was hit, and she thinks as long as I don't hit and scream, I'm being a good parent. So not hitting and screaming is the strategy, and it's certainly better than hitting and screaming, but there's like so much other stuff to know about. And my children would tell you I was very strict. If you ask them, they would say she was really strict. But then again, they all launched. They all launched right out of high school, graduated, went to college, completed college in the normal time frame, and got jobs and never were on the dole or home after that, So I probably was strict, but I think I had purposeful strictness, and I was asking things that were reasonable things because they imparted skills.
It seems like so many parents are afraid to occupy that position of authority, or maybe don't have a clear vision of what that is. And then they end up afraid, and then it seems like there's kind of this feedback loop where the kid's fear and the parent's fear are sort of amplifying each other because both have lost sight of who's really in charge here. So one of the principles I sort of reorient parents to when they need it is remembering not only that you are the adult, but that also you're responsible for setting the emotional tone. And then, I mean, I encounter so many households where, from talking to the parents, the kid is running the household emotionally and it's not working out for anyone. Everyone's miserable. The kid has an experience that I imagine was a lot like my own experience of, I'm in charge here and I really don't want to be, because what the heck do I know about being in charge of the emotional atmosphere of the home? I'm a troubled teen with, a trauma history and reckless impulses, right? So what do I know about this? Plus it's my instinct to test for limits, try to figure out where the boundaries are, try to grab for power. In some cases, like you're saying, wanting to hear no, and then feeling alarmed when I'm not hearing it, because again, I'm in charge. What do I know about being in charge? So I imagine that the kid is having this experience, and I love the way you put it earlier, that if the kid has the power to frighten the parent, then the kid is also learning that they are bad, right? So then I coach parents through realizing that nobody's benefiting from you allowing your kid to remain emotionally in charge. And so if the atmosphere that's being created by your kid being emotionally in charge of the household is one of fear, or that acronym fear, obligation, and guilt, FOG, from that book, Emotional Blackmail, right? If you're in the fog, fear, obligation, and guilt, it's time for you to regain control. And I think another thing is like the guilt part tends to confuse people because they don't know what they should be sorry for. So I have this sort of mantra I give people, which is, if I've done nothing wrong, I have nothing to apologize for. And if I have done something wrong, I have no problem apologizing. If you can own that, then you have nothing to be afraid of, because you've just found your integrity right there. If I have done something wrong, I have the ability to self-reflect, right? Part of self-regulation. I can be my own authority, reflect on, well, have I done something that is out of alignment with my values, with my goals for our household? If so, let me self-correct. Let me acknowledge that. If I haven't, I have nothing to be sorry for. But you end up with these households where the parents are apologizing for things they haven't done wrong. Like recognizing their child's correct sex, for instance, apologizing for that, which is why I teach this tool called strategic apologizing, which is where you understand that there's an attempt at power here and some kind of expression of aggression or disappointment. So you try to absorb some of the blows of that, right? You're like working with the energy of the adolescent's frustration. You're saying, I'm really sorry about, but then you're being very precise in how you frame what it is that you're sorry for and what it is that you're not sorry for.
Right. Like, I'm so sorry that you are missing this thing you wanted to do because you're grounded. And don't love that you're furious at me, and don't love that you're really unhappy about missing it. But I'm not changing my mind.
Or
reasons you're aware of,
Or I'm sorry that I have changed my mind about something because I know something now that I didn't know before. I'm sorry I didn't know this before.
Right.
Same with taking away the phone, or, let's say you have a 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old, where you should be in charge of parental controls. You should be deciding if your kid should even have a cell phone at all. And if so, what are the parameters around that? And so many parents gave their kid a phone at 13, regret it within a year. So if it feels to your kid like you're going backwards, like you're taking something away from them, then that's the part that you apologize for. I am sorry. It feels like I am taking something away from you. It feels like we're going backwards towards you having less freedom and independence and responsibility rather than more. And that's got to feel weird.
My mistake. I should not have led you to believe that this phone was a fixture for you.
Exactly. My mistake was that I gave it to you in the first place because I didn't know then what I know now.
Well, and, I mentioned a minute ago about authoritative, and I think that's a really important distinction, which I'm sure you're aware of, the difference between an authoritarian parent, an authoritative parent, and I guess the pushover, but I don't remember where that
passive or...
Yeah. And the worst is an authoritarian who's just arbitrary and mean. The next worst is the one who says yes all the time. And the sweet spot is the sometimes no for good reason, yes where possible, not coercive, emotionally trustworthy. And I think my parents were just like, my mom was more of a pushover and my dad was more of an authoritarian, but he was authoritative. I would give him authoritative because I didn't think he couldn't be reached and I didn't think he was always unfair. I felt like he was often fair. And, it's just like, how do you help a parent grab a whole set of behaviors and a whole way of thinking about interrelating with their child that didn't get built from baby steps up? It's just got to be so, so hard. And, of course, you are always empowered to say, well, new rules, didn't know before. Now I do know. This is how we're doing it now. Sorry, it's a big change, but we're making this change. And you have the authority, even if you don't know you have it. The minute you take it, you have it, But there's two things. If you've been led to believe that crossing someone's wishes is being mean to them, that would make it hard to take your authority. And the other thing that would make it really hard is you might have to bear the full weight of how unhappy your kid is. And I think that for many people is sort of the sticking point, because if they placate, then their whole enchilada doesn't come out and they don't have to deal with it, that it's placated and it's quiet again.
And that there's an example that you gave earlier that I thought illustrated that point really well, because the way that you provided the example really made it clear that the parent had one goal in that conversation, which was to make sure the kid knew what the new boundary was. And I advise this, it's part of my course. It's when you are informing your child about a new rule or boundary, or about how things are going to be, or about the fact that they're not getting something that maybe you told them you'd think about. That is your one goal in that conversation, is to deliver that news. I'm sorry, I've thought about it, and the answer is no. Right? If you can walk away from that conversation with them understanding that the answer is no, you've done your job. But I think a lot of parents I talk to, they have such a desire for their kid to understand and agree with them and feel good about their decision, right? And the truth is, like, a kid is going to be disappointed and mad, and they're not going to understand your reasoning, which is why I say, with regard to, and you include, when you define authoritative, you make sure to include sharing your reasoning. But I have some practices around advising not sharing your reasoning just any old time, saying something like, for example, if the kid is really upset, I understand you're really upset right now. I'm happy to explain my reasons for this when you're ready to hear them. Right now, though, it seems like your feelings are really big. So maybe we just need to give you some time to adjust to this news before we talk about why, So compartmentalizing it a little bit, which I think is good modeling of the fact that when we are emotionally dysregulated, that's not necessarily a time that our brains are open to new information, like why someone else made a decision that we don't agree with.
And if you're just trying to get up to speed with setting the boundary, don't bite off more than you can chew. Just set the darn boundary and elegantly leave.
And you have to be ready for that one thing. And I've seen parents screw this up. And when you screw it up, it's like, well, now your boundary's meaningless and you've just set yourself back, right? Because it needs to be clear. If you go into a conversation with the goal of delivering certain news that your kid is not going to like, that is your only goal, right? And you have to be willing to say, I'm sorry that you're so disappointed by my decision. And just like the example you gave back earlier, I'll check on you in a couple hours, and having what's within bounds and what's outside of bounds in terms of how that kid is allowed to process their disappointment. If they want to sulk and listen to music, that's fine. If they want to go on Discord and talk to their trans friends, no, they're not allowed to talk to their trans friends right now online about how they're mad at your decision because you know that's going to make things worse. Wherever the boundaries might be, variable from one situation to another. But I've seen so many parents end up kind of screwing up their attempts to set a boundary because they try to accomplish so many different things in one conversation.
Well, or they don't want their kid to be mad at them. There are parents who are so busy placating because they're just afraid to wear a child's great disappointment and anger. And it's like, you're not going to die from that. It's okay if your kid thinks you're a total asshole. That's okay. Who hasn't felt that way once in a while about their parents? I just don't see that it's a be all end all problem. But I think what happens is parents are so busy wanting their kid to know that I'm coming at this from a well-meaning place, that it's like challenging and upsetting to have the kid reject that interpretation.
Well, but what's really paradoxical about that is that if the parent is dependent on the child for shoring up their self-image of being a person with good and not corrupt motives, then ultimately that instills doubt in the child, right? Because someone who's actually got a clear conscience and understands that their own motives are coming from the right place, they're not going to put that on a child to reflect that back to them.
Right. You don't need it. And you hope that like one day, maybe not too long from now, or maybe years from now, you hope that one day it'll be recognized that you did some hard decisions with grit and heart for good reasons, but they may not. They may still think you're strict, And it's just that and again, you would feel a lot more afraid of a child that you didn't have a day in, day out, mostly having a good time together experience of living with, if this was your 1-2 hour window of the day, dinner. I mean, it's cruel and inhuman that dinner and bedtime would be the main time you'd spend with a tired, cranky kid who's 4. And I just think that parents that are stuck in that are not developing the kinds of skills that they need. And I'm not really sure what the answer is, because some of it is a sort of a long slog through long days. Some of the ways you get good at it, some of the ways your kids get good at hearing it is practice, So I think it's really important that I do apologize to my kids when I've hurt them, when I've made a mistake. If I'm aware I've made a mistake, I absolutely apologize. And it's much easier than defending against it, But there was something else you were just saying about explaining the reasons. Like, for example, you could explain the reasons why you are not supporting a trans identity very factually. This doesn't make sense to me. How can I endorse something that I think is illogical? Why do I think it's illogical? Oh, it only showed up 10 years ago. You can talk that through with someone who's mad as hell and thinks you're wrong and slamming the door, but I don't see that any parent should hesitate to give their honest assessment of what they really think about this highly risky idea that their kid has brought to them, and whether they think their kid has the kind of emotional maturity and sobriety to make those decisions. You shouldn't have to be afraid to say, I know more than you. I've been alive for 45 years, 35 of which didn't have this topic anywhere in adolescence. So, you may think I'm just a dum-dum and I'm behind the times, but I don't think brand new important realities about humanity are discovered by middle schoolers and taught to parents. That's unlikely, And I think it's also important that a parent could say, who would I be if I pretended to buy into something that I think is completely far-fetched and quite dangerous. Who would I be if I just went, oh, okay, that's what you want? Okay, sure. I would just not even be your parent. I wouldn't be your mother. I wouldn't be your friend. How could I say that I cared about you and cross my fingers behind my back and just nod along? Like I couldn't do that. That's not who I am. That's not moral character. And I just think if you can frame even a really disagreeing stance that way, it's going to take a little bit of an edge off the child judging you for it, because you aren't saying, this is against God or whatever. You're saying this is against logic, and my job is to slow you down when I see something that's a bad plan. And if I can become if you can convince me of the merit of a plan, it's a different thing. But I'm not convinced yet.
I think the examples that you gave would be beautifully effective for a lot of the families with the younger kids, where they still, they're still under your roof. You still have the time and the ability to influence, and especially where there is secure attachment and where the foundation of the relationship, the kid can hear everything that the parent just said, as you exemplified, and, deep down go, yeah, that checks out, right? That seems really consistent with my mom's character. So it feels like a reality check. I think it's trickier when there's a family where they're really fearing estrangement from an adult child. I've worked with families where they have, let's say, a kid in their 20s who has given them reason to believe that if the kid believes that the parents don't support the trans identity, they will completely cut them off. And the parents consult with me at a time when they haven't revealed all their cards yet. They haven't told their kid what they really think. From a lot of those from those situations, I often sort of assess, at this point in time, all the information that your child does not have is information that gives you a leg up in a situation where you're otherwise at an extreme disadvantage. They're in a world where everyone else but you is going to support this. Their doctors, therapists, friends, everyone is going to encourage this. The college staff, if they're in college. So sometimes keeping cards closer to your chest and plotting very carefully strategically, I can teach parents techniques for that. It just goes to show how, what's going to work for one family is different from another. But that being said, I think there are a lot of families who could afford to take more risks, especially with the younger ones who are in some ways kind of looking to them to mirror their own doubts about this. Like you gave the example earlier of when your daughter was on the phone. And for those who were just listening, you explained that she was shaking her head no while claiming to be asking you. I think there are a lot of similar situations where the request for a boundary is not nearly so overt. But I think parents get so frightened by this whole trans thing and so thrown off by it for the ones who didn't see it coming that it's like they lose their logic. They lose their own logic. And it becomes difficult for them to see ways in which, despite whatever their kid is saying or doing, their kid is actually revealing that they have doubts about this. They're just not saying it. They're not saying, I'm not sure, right? Because why would they do it like that? Like you have to learn. Yeah.
Between the lines is a skill. Again, it's a practice skill. You see a kid come home from school and they're kind of like downcast and giving you one-word answers. You've seen that 3 times, something happened at school. It's just not. Reading between the lines is very much a right brain kind of a skill, and it's entering into the mind of another person, which isn't always easy for people, and checking what you're observing against what it's bringing up in your own feelings, in your own body, and having the confidence to know that you've probably read it pretty close to what's going on, and maybe there's going to be a little adjustment, But if your kid says, oh, nothing happened, say, oh, come on, you're not yourself, like follow it up a few times, and maybe they're not going to be ready to talk about it that day. But Yeah, I think the problem of a 20-something kid who is, and you've got an axe above your neck that they're going to cut off the family, is that horse is so out of the barn that it's got to be so difficult. I think my instinct would be, if they smelled doubt on me and that was my situation, I'd say, what do you want me to do? Lie or tell the truth and respect that you're old enough to make your own life, but tell you the truth of what I think would be a wise move at this juncture? Because I could just fake it, but I don't think that shows you any respect. And like, put your differentiation from a point of view of, I wouldn't lie to a friend I thought was making a mistake. I wouldn't lie to my sister if I thought she was making a mistake. I'm certainly not going to lie to you. I could hold my tongue. You know, we've got choices, but one of them isn't pretending and lying. That I'm not going to do. You know, and I'm thinking of one trans-identified person I know. I've been honest with them and said, this is not a belief system I subscribe to. And I don't really care, you know, how a person presents himself to the world and what their style is and what floats their boat. But, you know, I just see it differently. And this person doesn't seem to have a problem interacting with me. But I was honest, just saying, this is not how I think about it, but I'm willing to respect your autonomy to have your own thoughts.
Today's sponsor, Cozy Earth, is offering my listeners 40% off their selection of luxurious bedding, bath sheets, lounge apparel, and skincare products. Transform your space into a sanctuary of serenity and renewal. Check out their best-selling bamboo sheet set and plush luxe bath sheets. Visit cozyearth.com/sometherapist and use promo code SOMETHERAPIST to take 40% off your purchase. If you get a post-purchase survey, say that you heard about Cozy Earth from this podcast and they'll send you a free set of socks. All right, now back to the show. I'm going to mention a can of worms, but not open it. So when you were giving that example, Laura, of really clear, authoritative communication, what do you want me to do? Lie? Actually, let me put that thought on pause just to reflect that I think one of the skills you're modeling throughout our conversation is the way that you're non-verbally communicating as well. People can hear in your vocal tone that your tone is either authoritative in like a calm, clear, this is how it's going to be, right? So the right pace, going down at the end, not defensive or heightened, right? So there's that tone that you use. And then there's also like a playful tone that you use. And both of those are really important nonverbal forms of nonverbal communication, that if you said the exact same words in an anxious or angry tone, it would come across as a completely different communication. So I just wanted to bring listeners' attention to that piece because it's equally important as the words. But that being said, as you were giving that most recent example of what do you want me to do, lie, I was thinking about a family I know that I basically coached through having that exact conversation. And the kid's answer was yes. And so the can of worms I'm going to mention but not open for today, because that's a whole other conversation, is that some of these kids, I mean, first of all, there's like a dangling carrot that they're always chasing with the gender affirmation. They're always telling you that their happiness lies just around the next corner. And it's hard to believe because it's not true. But, and there's an insatiability to it. But this idea that I am going to be satisfied by people lying to me, that is a cluster B idea. And I'm just going to put a pin in that. And when I say cluster B, I mean the traits and behaviors associated with narcissistic, borderline, histrionic, and antisocial personality disorders. And there's a lot of overlap between the traits and behaviors of those disorders and the gender madness. And they all go together with certain beliefs about social justice, and together those three things form a trifecta. And so my course is about the trifecta, how to deal with all of it. So I hear the Yes, I do want you to lie to me, peace. I just want you to feed me the image of myself that I want to be fed, not the image that you see. Well, that's a narcissistic behavior, and that points to a deeper problem.
Well, the other thing is those cluster B behaviors do source in lack of attachment and neglect in early life. So it's all of the same piece, because it's like that by the time the kid has gotten into this cluster B behavior, that's not something one diagnoses quite young. It's something maybe as a teenager you'd say showing traits, and then in adulthood you might make that diagnosis. And part of it is because younger people are less regulated and they haven't always developed some of the skills that they still can develop in avoiding a cluster B, result. But the cluster B behaviors strike me as feeling so bad about how things are that you want to control how everybody regards you and treats you and speaks to you and the language that they use and what everything. It's like, I was thinking of the movie Carnal Knowledge with Jack Nicholson, and he's such a control freak that he has to have his girlfriend act out a script every time they have sex, fluffing him up in the ways that he needs to be fluffed up to be powerful so that he can perform sexually, and then she makes a mistake and the whole thing falls apart. And it's a false, as you point out, you're not going to be made happy by everybody pretending, because then you'll just get to the next crossroad and people won't know what their script is, and they'll do and say things that disappoint you, and you'll just get to the next thing. It's never over if you need to control the responses and reactions of other people in order to regulate yourself, But I think even a cluster B person, I really have a strong belief in if you authentically love a person and have credibility as a loving person, I think even a really angry, mentally unhealthy relative can be talked to from the loving and honest place. And again, it may take a number of repetitions before anything gets through. But, you're not having a relationship with somebody that you're kowtowing to and having to lie to, or they're going to axe you, just like you're not having a relationship with a man who makes you, feel you have to tap dance like that, just to keep him happy. Like, you're not relating to that person. You're just being abused by them. And I don't know, I don't know what the answer would be. I think it would be very, very, very hard for me to give up on anybody that I loved. But I think it would be harder for me to perform an inauthentic version of myself in order to be reprieved from, rejection.
And some parents are in that difficult place of having to make that decision of, do I let go of trying to have a relationship with my child at all in order to not tolerate abuse? Because some ROGD parents settle for really one-sided relationships where it's, just taking or just abuse, or sometimes they just settle for, well, I pay my kid's cell phone bill so that I can see who they're texting, and that's it. And that's all that they have. And sometimes it's like, well, am I better off like that, or taking the plunge and setting a limit and being authentic and knowing that they might not talk to me for years?
It's so heart-wrenching. The pit parents pieces that go up on Twitter, and at GenSpect, some of the people that I sat with when I went to Denver were parents in that situation, some estranged, long estranged, years estranged. And there they are showing up at GenSpect, 6 years later, trying to better understand what's going on with their child who has totally broken their heart and won't speak to them. So I don't know, like, it's just so painful to witness the deep love and terrible disappointment of some of these parents. And I really can't imagine how you deal with it. But I just know that if you feel in your heart of hearts that something is terrible and wrong for your child, I think you're kind of obligated to say so. If you say it's not wrong and it's great, you're enabling something. I don't know. I mean, if they're determined to do it, whether or not you enable, I don't know what to say. I think it's really important to try to build these skills at an earlier point in time, if you possibly can. And some things might be even at 20 would be like, look, I know I've heard of parents that have sort of bargained with their trans-identified kids to say, just don't medicalize till you're 25. Like, get out of college and I'll pay for college. You don't have insurance and you can do it, but please wait. And then hoping that they outgrow it. I've heard that as a tactic.
I think that buys you time, but in itself, it's not enough, because I've definitely met families that do that. And as long as you are working on other things to try to get through to them in a different way. But the problem is some of these young people spend important years of their lives reinforcing this obsessive thought about who they are and these obsessive behaviors. Even if they're not medicalizing, it's the things they're doing to try to pass and socially transition and all that kind of stuff. And it's not insignificant to spend, the years 18 through 23, for instance, in this belief system. And I meet so many parents where they've been in this for years, and then they reach out to me because there's some ticking time bomb. Like, their kid's turning 18 in 6 months, or their kid, the most extreme example was, I'd never met this parent before, and they reached out the week before their child had a surgery scheduled. And so we were able to meet once, and I was able to say, here's, given what little I know about your situation, what you could try now, but, it was too little too late. So I try to be realistic when families contact me and they're like, yeah, there's this thing happening like next week. Can you help us? I'm like, I don't know you well enough to I can give you some general tools, and that's what my course will be for. But I would definitely advise, if you're listening to this and you're not that deep into it, or you don't have a trans-identified kid, but you have kids, you have to be prepared and to start early. And yeah, I do agree. I mean, I've seen situations where maybe the kid's only been trans-identified for a year, but the behaviors and the relational problems are definitely indicative of a problem going way back. And if you had a problem with setting boundaries and giving your kid natural consequences when it was like ordinary parenting stuff, you are going to have a much bigger problem when they start thinking that they're the opposite sex.
Right. And it almost seems like maybe, and this is just a fleeting thought, and it probably doesn't apply to every situation, but maybe there are parents who are so accommodating that there aren't that many ways for the kid to really get their goat and up the ante to the level of, cage fighting, besides something like I'm trans, or I'm not going to college or whatever, something that's kind of big. Because I think children would like to have parents who can take appropriate authority. I think most children want that, and it makes them feel safer. And so if you've never kind of taken appropriate authority, or you've just let this go and you've let that go, it might not be that surprising that your kid is going to pick a more noxious behavior to test out on you. And yeah, I would say to any parents who are feeling shaky about saying no to their kids, get on that in grammar school and realize how much no is important, and how not being a doormat is modeling how they're not going to be a doormat. There's so much more to it than, oh, I disappointed my child by giving an answer they don't like. You have to be able to have credibility. Your child should understand that sometimes the most loving answer that a parent can give is no. Sometimes that's built into the relationship. Kids do stuff that, aggravates parents, and parents do stuff that aggravates kids. It's just part of it. And learning how to be aggravated, wend your way through, resolve it, have a rupture, have a repair. These are all like things that make you closer down the line. And so just trust them. And I always mention Gordon Neufeld, but I think Gordon Neufeld is just brilliant on this stuff. And he says, you just basically have to be a person who they care about pleasing. They care about and trust, and then you've got the credibility and authority. And one of the main things you provide as a parent is the place to cry when life gives a bad answer. You didn't make the team, you're not in the play, whatever it might be. If you're the person that your kid can call sobbing and say, pick me up right now, and you can comfort them and you can help them face something that's like a no answer and have their back while they're facing that no, rather than rescuing them, rather than calling the, theater arts department and griping that your kid didn't get a part in the play or whatever. You don't have to fix it. You just have to model what we do when we're terribly disappointed by an answer, and Gordon Neufeld has a couple of really good YouTubes, but the one that I'm thinking of, he's just talking about how if you develop this credibility, then the rest of parenting is just kind of easier. It's just they trust that you have their back. Sometimes the no comes from you. You still comfort them when they're disappointed, and they develop resilience to deal with disappointments, little disappointments and big ones. Yeah, it's really, really hard for people that find themselves here with a 17-year-old who's full of hormones and is peer-oriented. That's another thing Neufeld talks about, is that there's a point in time when your kids will turn to their peers. And if you aren't that person who is a place for them to cry already, you're going to have a very hard time retrieving that kind of a relationship, because, the time to get the credibility as the place to cry is, kind of like up to 12 or so before they're, and, this is the terrible thing with this culture. Like, it used to be that if you had a kid with a pending personality disorder profile coming up with a really terrible idea, they might have peers, or a creepy person online who's encouraging that idea. But it's only just recently that a therapist and a teacher and a counselor and a friend's mom might all encourage your child in their terrible idea. I mean, which is really asking a great deal of this parent when they have to override the whole culture and they're already on thin ice with their kid. So that's just another horror that parents are going through now. There seem to be this infinite number of brainless people who will ratify these terrible ideas, not even knowing your child, not even knowing about their autism or their abuse history or whatever else may be going on with them.
Yeah, exactly. And going back to what you said earlier about saying no makes me think of the fact that if you're a parent, you have a mission. And the ultimate goal of your mission is to make sure your kids will be okay when you're gone. And so what does that mean? Well, you probably want them to have someone to love who loves them back. So as part of that, are there behaviors you're tolerating that they're learning are okay, that no self-respecting human being would tolerate in a romantic relationship? You probably want your kid to be able to support themselves, or are you teaching them to respect hard work and cherish the fruits of their labor? Are you teaching them how to get along with a variety of people? I mean, these are all things where if you're not willing to say no within the context of the unconditional love that you have, then are you, in the end, crippling them from developing the capacities they will need to support themselves when you're gone? And sometimes I have to say that, and it's a really sobering thing to say to someone, but it's a reminder, it's a wake-up call, because so many parents end up in this pattern of enabling that it's like, well, they're not going to make it without you around.
And we had sort of said this right before we started recording about enmeshment, which is the opposite kind of pattern. Well, I guess enmeshment can be enabling too, but you can have an ostensibly close relationship with a not angry kid and still not be standing in reality and modeling good boundaries and being all caught up in them. I remember a neighbor we had, and she literally talked to her children in college every day. And it made me feel like I had been a parent because, 10, 12, 15 days would go by. Maybe 15 days would go by. I'd think, gosh, they haven't called me. Let me make sure what's going on. And I would text them and they'd say, oh, yeah, everything's great. And then I'd just back away again because I didn't talk to my parents. When I was in college, we didn't have even cell phones, we didn't even have answering machines. So maybe they called me and it rang, and I wasn't there, and that was that. And, weeks went by. So I just felt it was hovering to check in on the telephone every day. I don't know. That did not seem normal to me. Maybe it's normal, now, but I'm not sure it's really healthy because it kind of is saying, are you okay? Are you okay? Check, am I okay? Are we connected? And I kind of think maybe, I don't think my children felt like I didn't care to talk to them. I just think they felt like they were doing their own thing and I was respecting it. But with this electronic leash we now have with kids, it might be a lot harder to navigate the appropriate level of looking in on someone, like if they're on a field trip, do you check in? Did you eat dinner? Are you up? Did you wake up? I mean, I think there are parents who are doing that for their teenagers, making sure they woke up, which seems alarming.
There's also a common trend of kids not being particularly motivated to leave their parents' house, which is really weird when it's in combination with kids identifying as trans and parents not believing in it. Like, that's a weird combination. And I've even had, I can't remember the age of the child. They were at least 20 though. And the parent was reporting to me that the child threatened to move out if the parent didn't support the idea. And I was like, okay, well, try saying this. Sweetheart, whatsoever makes you think that I don't celebrate you having the independence to move out? I would love for you to move out, and that's, this is perfect time for that. I don't see what that has to do with the gender stuff. I just want to make sure when you move out that you're healthy and you're able to support yourself. And frankly, as long as you're on this gender stuff, it seems like it's consuming all your attention and not necessarily going to help you thrive out there in the world.
I wonder if it's a way of separating without separating.
Totally.
I can piss you off, oppose you, and totally differentiate from you while you bring me dinner.
And there's so many things like that. Like, for example, I meet so many families where they tell me their kid's chosen name, their trans name, and it bears a striking similarity to either their birth name, mother's maiden name, grandmother's name, something in their family history. And it's like, okay, so on the one hand, they're trying to sever the connection and say, this is my dead name and I reject the name you give me and everything. But on the other hand, even in the forging of a new identity, they're trying to cling on to their family and their history. So if you know what to look for, it's like you said earlier, reading between the lines is a skill. And that's what I teach people to do. If you know what to look for, there are signs of ambivalence and doubt written all over the behavior of these trans-identified kids. But the parents are so afraid of what they say they're determined to do that they miss the signs of ambivalence.
Do you remember it was Sage's Law, that story? Sage's trans name was Draco. And, there is no one named Draco except the villain in Harry Potter, And if you pick a name like Draco or Adolf, you're probably saying something very self-hating about yourself. You're not, some of these names are loaded with symbolism. And so if you're saying the real me is Draco, you're not just saying I'm a boy, you're saying I'm a bad, evil, corrupt boy. And that might just be saying I don't feel like a strong self person and I hate myself. And so it might have zero to do with gender, but it's a way of saying I'm not who you think I am. I'm really a bad person.
Isn't it interesting too that someone named Sage would choose that name because Sage is kind of a gender neutral name? And then you also hear these stories about kids changing their names 3 and 4 times in the course of a year, And again, it's just like identity instability is a sign of possible borderline personality disorder, people. And this is getting missed by clinicians.
I'm aware of a child of somebody that I know who is now an adult and medicalizing, non-binary, but medicalizing. Another thing I don't.
Oh, that's another one. Yep.
Particularly understand, but this person put a post up on social media talking about still haven't got the euphoria. And I thought to myself, this kid has been unhappy and identity seeking since they were a young teenager. They changed their name 2 times prior to gender ever coming along. And so I shared with their mom, I just said, look, it seems to me that this is the same wheel going around and around and around again, and that your child may think that this gender frame provides an answer to this long-term chronic problem. But my bet is this is a long-term chronic problem, and there's going to be a next iteration of it because I've seen now 3 or 4 turns of this wheel. And I said that because the mother was very afraid of not being supportive enough. This is an adult. There's nothing that this mother can really say or do at this point. But I think I had the impression that this mom might have been feeling a little bit like a hostage, like.
I keep looking for a good moment to wrap up the conversation, but everything you say is so valuable. It's like, well, that brings up another thing, because I use the analogy of hostage situations a lot. And some of the techniques I use are derived from Chris Voss, the expert hostage negotiator. But with that said, I'm going to have to interrupt our conversation and make sure that we move on with our days. It's always such a pleasure talking with you, Laura. Thank you so much for joining me today. So remind people where they can find you.
I'm on Twitter at Haynes_Wiley. And please say hi.
Thanks so much, Laura. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of You Must Be Some Kind of Therapist podcast. To check out my book recommendations, articles, wellness products, guest episodes on other podcasts, consulting services, and lots more, visit sometherapist.com. Or follow me on Twitter or Instagram at sometherapist. If you'd like to go deeper, join my community at somekindoftherapist.locals.com. Members can dialogue with other listeners, post questions for upcoming podcast guests to respond to, or ask questions for me to respond to in exclusive members-only Q&A live streams. To learn more about the gender crisis, watch our film, No Way Back, The Reality of Gender-Affirming Care, at nowaybackfilm.com. Special thanks to Joey Pecoraro for our theme song, Half Awake. If you appreciate this podcast and want more people to find it, kindly take a moment to rate, review, like, comment, and share on your platforms of choice. Of course, just because I am some therapist doesn't mean I'm your therapist. This podcast is not a substitute for medical advice. If you need help, ask your doctor, or browse your local therapists online. And whatever you do next, please take care of yourself. Eat well, sleep well, move your body, get outside, and tell someone you love them. You're worth it.